It was a Tuesday night in November, the kind of cold that gets through your jacket and settles in your bones, when Nadia's whole world cracked open right there on the kitchen floor of their tiny apartment. She had just finished her shift at the grocery store, 12 hours on her feet, scanning items, smiling at strangers, pretending everything was fine, and she had come home to find her mother, Rose, standing at the stove making soup like she always did, humming some old song under her breath, and for one small moment, everything felt normal. But then Rose stopped humming. Her hand grabbed the counter, her knuckles went white, and before Nadia could even say, "Mom," Rose was on the floor. Not slowly, not gracefully. She just went down, and the sound of it, that awful sound, is something Nadia says she will never forget for as long as she lives. She dropped to her knees beside her mother, grabbed her hand, felt how cold it already was, and her brain just stopped working the way a brain is supposed to work in a crisis. She had told herself 100 times what to do in an emergency. She had even saved the number in her phone. But when you are kneeling on a cold kitchen floor next to the one person in the world you cannot lose, your hands stop listening to your brain. She grabbed her phone. She dialed what she thought was 911, and she pressed it to her ear and waited for that dispatcher's voice. That calm, steady voice that is supposed to tell you everything is going to be okay. But the voice that answered was not a dispatcher. It was a man, unhurried, a little surprised, and he said, "Hello?" And Nadia screamed at him that her mother had collapsed, that she wasn't moving right, that she needed an ambulance right now. And there was this 1 second of silence on the other end that felt like a year. And then the man did something she did not expect. He didn't hang up. He didn't say she had the wrong number. He just said, very quietly, "Okay, I'm right here. Don't hang up." He told her to check if her mother was breathing. He told her to roll her gently onto her side. He talked her through it step by step in this calm, even voice like he had done this before. And somewhere in the background, she could hear him talking to someone else, giving her address to someone. And she didn't even know how he had her address because she hadn't told him, but she was too scared to ask. She just kept talking to him, kept answering his questions, kept her hand on her mother's shoulder. And about 4 minutes later, she heard the sirens outside, and she has said in every interview since that those sirens were the most beautiful sound she had ever heard in her life. The paramedics came through the door. They took over. They got Rose stabilized. And Nadia stood up on shaking legs and walked out to the porch and sat down on the cold steps and finally let herself fall apart. She was still holding her phone. The call was still connected. And the man on the other end, whoever he was still there. He didn't say anything for a while. He just stayed on the line while she cried. And after a minute, he said, very gently, "She's in good hands now. You did good." Nadia didn't even ask his name. She just whispered thank you and ended the call and sat there in the dark with her arms around her knees, shaking, listening to the paramedics working inside, staring at the cracked concrete of the porch steps like they might have some answer to the question that was already starting to form in her mind. Because in all the terror of those few minutes, one small detail had started to work its way through the fog. The man who answered had not sounded confused. He had not sounded like a dispatcher who gets these calls every hour. He had sounded like a person who was home, alone, on a quiet night, and had picked up the phone not expecting anything and had chosen, in that moment, to show up completely for a stranger he had never met. She didn't know his name yet. She had no idea who he was. But she would find out in the morning, and when she did, she would sit in that hospital waiting room with her mouth open, reading the same sentence on her phone screen over and over again, unable to fully believe that any of this was real. The next morning, Nadia was sitting in a hard plastic chair in the hospital waiting room with a paper cup of cold coffee in her hand and her mother's cardigan folded in her lap. and her brain was still running on fumes from the night before when she remembered the call. Not the ambulance. Not the doctors. The man. The one who had answered when she dialed wrong. The one who had stayed calm when she couldn't. The one who somehow knew to send help before she had even told him where she lived. She stared at her phone for a long moment, then opened her recent calls, and there it was, an unknown number. The call lasting 4 minutes and 32 seconds, which felt impossible because it had felt like both 10 seconds and 10 years at the same time. She pressed the number into a search bar, not really expecting anything, maybe a business name or a customer service line, and what came back stopped her cold. The first result was a news article, then another, then a profile from a major financial magazine. And right at the top of the page, looking back at her from a professional photograph with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from having absolutely nothing left to prove, was the face of a man named Thomas Drayton, founder of a biotech company, former engineer, and according to 3 separate publications, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $4.2 billion. Nadia read that number twice. Then she put her phone face down on her knee and just sat there for a second, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, because her brain genuinely did not know what to do with that information. She had called one of the wealthiest people in the country by accident, from a cracked screen phone, while kneeling on a kitchen floor in a grocery store uniform, screaming about her mother. And he had stayed on the line. He had helped her. He had not said, "You have the wrong number," and hung up like most people would have. Like honestly most people would have every right to do. And she kept turning that fact over in her mind like a coin she couldn't figure out if it was real or not. She looked him up more carefully after that. Thomas Drayton had started his company in his late 20s with almost nothing, had lost his wife to illness about 7 years ago, had one son he rarely spoke about publicly, and had quietly become one of the larger private donors to medical research in the country, though he seemed to go out of his way to keep that part of his life out of the press. People who had worked with him described him as direct, serious, not particularly warm in a boardroom, but fair in a way that people remembered. Nobody seemed to know much about what his personal life looked like now. And then Nadia found the detail that made everything click into place. A small mention in a local business brief from a few months earlier, noting that a private medical consultation line that had operated in her city for years had recently shut down and its old number had been reassigned. Rose had saved that number in her phone years ago, under the name Dr. Emergency. And when Nadia had grabbed her mother's phone in a panic and hit dial without reading carefully, she had called a number that no longer belonged to any clinic at all. It belonged to Thomas Drayton's private line. She sat with that for a long time. Then, 2 days after the surgery consultation, while she was back at the hospital waiting for results and running on almost no sleep, her phone rang from that same unknown number, and she answered it before she even thought about whether she should. And his voice was exactly the same as she remembered it, unhurried, a little careful, like someone who had thought about what he was going to say before he said it. He asked how her mother was doing. Just that. No explanation, no big speech, no mention of who he was or what he was worth. Just a straightforward question from one human being to another. And something about the simplicity of it hit her harder than she expected. She told him Rose was stable, but that they were still waiting on results. He said he was glad she had made it through the night. There was a brief silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just honest. The kind of silence that happens between people who've already been through something real, together even if they've never actually met. And then he said he hoped things got easier for her soon, and she said, "Thank you." And after she hung up, she sat there for a full minute just looking at the floor, because she had no idea what any of this was, but she had a feeling, deep and quiet and a little bit frightening, that it wasn't over, The doctor's exact words were significant: cardiac damage and surgical intervention. Within 90 days, and Nadia heard them the way you hear things when your brain is, protecting you from the full weight of what is being said. Like the words were coming from the end of a long hallway, clear enough to understand, but too heavy to fully hold all at once. She sat in that small consultation room with her hands folded in her lap, and she nodded. And she asked the right questions, and she wrote down the numbers the doctor gave her on a folded piece of paper from her purse. And then she walked out to her car in the hospital parking lot, sat down in the driver's seat, and looked at what she had written. The surgery would cost close to $190,000. Their insurance, the bare minimum plan she could afford on her grocery store wages, would cover a portion of it. The portion it would not cover was still more money than Nadia had made in the last 4 years combined. She sat in that parking lot for a long time. She did not cry. She had already used up a lot of tears, and she needed what was left of her energy for something more useful than crying. So she just sat there and thought, really thought, about every possible angle. The way you do when you are a person who has never had the option of giving up, because there was always someone depending on you. She started a crowdfunding page that same night, wrote every word of it herself, kept it honest and plain, and didn't ask for sympathy. Just explained the situation the way it was, and shared it everywhere she could think of. Her co-workers shared it. Her neighbors shared it. A woman she hadn't spoken to since high school shared it with a long caption that made Nadia cry a little after all. After 2 weeks, the page had raised just over $3,000, which felt both like a miracle and like standing at the edge of a canyon with a piece of string. And Nadia was working a second job by then, picking up overnight cleaning shifts at an office building across town, running on 4 hours of sleep most nights, visiting her mother every afternoon in between, and quietly selling anything she owned that someone else might want to buy. And it was somewhere in the middle of all of that, exhausted, running out of options, too proud to admit how scared she was, that Thomas called again. She almost didn't answer. She was sitting on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by things she was pricing for an online sale, when her phone lit up. And she stared at his number for 3 rings before she picked up. And when she did, she wasn't in the mood for careful conversation. She was just tired, and she told him so without really meaning to. Told him she was fine, but that she was very tired. And instead of filling the silence with something polite, he just asked her directly how the situation stood with her mother's surgery. She told him the truth. She didn't dress it up or make it sound more manageable than it was. She just said the number out loud. Said what the insurance wasn't covering. Said what she had raised so far. And there was a pause on his end, a real one. The kind where you can tell a person is actually thinking and not just waiting for their turn to speak. And then he said, quietly and without any ceremony at all, that he would like to cover the cost of the surgery fully through a private health trust. No press, no conditions, no expectation of anything in return. And he said it the way you might offer someone an umbrella in the rain, simply, like it was just the obvious thing to do. Nadia said no. She said it fast and firm and a little sharply. And she told him she appreciated everything he had already done, but that she was not going to take money from a stranger, no matter who he was. And she could hear in the silence that followed that he was not offended, just patient. And he said he understood completely, and that the offer would stand if she ever changed her mind. And they ended the call, and she put her phone down and sat there in the middle of her half-sorted apartment and pressed her hands over her face and stayed like that for a long time. 6 days passed. Rose's condition got worse. The doctors moved the timeline up. And at 2 in the morning, on a Wednesday, when the apartment was completely quiet and Nadia had been staring at the ceiling for an hour, she picked up her phone and she called him back. And when he answered, she didn't say hello or explain herself. She just said one word, "Okay," and her voice broke on it. Just slightly, just enough, and he said, "Okay," back, just as quietly. And somehow in that single exchange between two people who had started as a wrong number and a stranger, something shifted that neither of them had a name for yet, but both of them could feel. The surgery lasted 6 hours and 40 minutes. And Nadia knows that exact number because she watched every single minute tick by on the waiting room clock. The one with the slightly crooked hour hand. The one she had memorized down to the scratch on its plastic cover by the time the surgeon finally came through the double doors and told her that Rose had made it through and that everything had gone as well as they could have hoped. And Nadia stood up from that chair on legs that barely worked and thanked him, and then sat right back down because her body simply was not ready to hold her up yet. Thomas had not come to the hospital that day, and she hadn't expected him to. They were not at that point yet. They were still two people who mostly talked on the phone and carefully, slowly figured out what the other one was made of. But he had texted her that morning just 3 words, "Thinking of you both." And she had read it about 15 times throughout the day without fully understanding why it kept making her feel steadier. Rose spent 9 days in the hospital recovering, and somewhere around day 4 something unexpected happened. Thomas came to visit. Not with flowers or speech or any kind of announcement. He just showed up one afternoon while Nadia was there, knocked lightly on the open door of Rose's room, and introduced himself the way a normal person would, first name only, and Rose, who was sitting up in bed and sharper than anyone in that building gave her credit for, looked at him for a long moment and then said, "So you're the one who answered." And Thomas said, "I suppose I am." And Rose said, "Well, pull up a chair then. I don't like people standing in doorways." And that was that. What happened over the next few weeks of Rose's recovery was not dramatic or cinematic. It was actually quite ordinary on the surface, which is maybe why it meant so much. Thomas visited several more times, always in the late afternoon, always without making a big deal of it. And he and Rose talked the way two people talk when neither of them has anything to perform for the other. Honestly and sometimes bluntly and occasionally very funny. And Nadia would sit in the chair by the window and listen and feel something loosening in her chest that she hadn't even realized had been tight. She learned things about Thomas in those hospital room conversations that no profile or magazine article had ever captured. That he had grown up with very little, that he had taught himself most of what he knew by reading late at night after long shifts when he was young, that his wife had been the funnier one and the braver one, and that losing her had left him in a kind of fog that wealth had done absolutely nothing to lift, and that he had a son, grown now, who he hadn't had a real conversation with in years because somewhere along the way they had both said things that were hard to come back from, and neither of them had figured out how to take the first step. Rose listened to all of this, the way Rose listened to everything, carefully and without judgment, and then with complete honesty. And she told him one afternoon, while Nadia pretended to be very interested in something on her phone, that loneliness lived the longest in people who were too capable to ask for help. And Thomas was quiet for a moment, and then said that was probably the most accurate thing anyone had said to him in years. And somewhere in all of those afternoons, between the terrible hospital coffee and Rose's commentary on the nurses, shoes and the long conversations that stretched past visiting hours, something was quietly growing between Nadia and Thomas that neither of them was in a hurry to define or put a label on. Something that felt less like a romantic story beginning and more like two people recognizing each other in a way that was hard to explain but impossible to ignore. The way you sometimes meet someone and realize within a few conversations that they are going to matter to you, that they already do, that whatever this is, it is real, and it belongs to a category that the word friendship is too small for, and the word relationship is too loaded. For, and maybe the truest thing you can say about it, is simply that it was two people choosing to keep showing up for each other in a world that makes it very easy not to, and Rose, watching all of this from her hospital bed, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had seen enough of life to know something rare when it was right in front of her, never said a word about it to either of them. She just smiled sometimes when she thought they weren't looking, and pulled her cardigan a little tighter, and let it unfold. 3 months after Rose came home from the hospital, Nadia was sitting at a second-hand desk in the corner of their apartment with a lamp that flickered when the heat kicked on, filling out an application for an architecture program at the state university. And she almost didn't finish it because there was a section near the end that asked her to describe a moment that had changed the direction of her life. And she sat there for a long time staring at that question because the honest answer was so strange and so specific that she wasn't sure anyone reading it would believe her. But she wrote it anyway, wrote the whole thing plainly and without exaggerating a single detail, because the truth was already more than enough. And 3 weeks later she got a letter in the mail that she read standing in the hallway still wearing her coat. And then she walked into the kitchen where Rose was making tea and handed it to her without saying anything. And Rose read it and set it down on the counter and opened her arms, and Nadia walked into them the way she used to when she was small. And neither of them said anything for a while because some moments don't need words, and this was one of them. She called Thomas that evening and told him, and he laughed, a real laugh. The kind she had learned by then was not something he gave away easily. And he said he was not even a little bit surprised, and she told him to stop being so calm about everything for once in his life. And he laughed again, and that was the kind of conversation they had now. Easy and warm and full of the specific comfort that comes from knowing someone well enough to tease them. It was Thomas, a few weeks earlier, who had mentioned almost in passing that there was a grant available for students with demonstrated financial need who were pursuing design and community-focused architecture. A grant she had never heard of because nobody in her world had ever had a reason to know it existed. And he had sent her the link without making a production of it. The way he did things, quietly and without wanting credit. And she had applied, and apparently it had gone well because the letter was now on Rose's refrigerator, held up by a magnet, shaped like a pineapple, and Rose pointed at it every time anyone came to the apartment. But the thing that stayed with Nadia, the thing she thought about more than the acceptance letter or the grant, or any of the practical ways her life was shifting into something new, was something that had happened a few weeks before all of that. Something small that had turned out to be very large. Thomas had a son named by those close to him simply as Caleb. That was what Nadia knew him as from the conversations. And the two of them had not spoken in years. Not really spoken, not in any way that counted. And one evening, Nadia had sat down at that same flickering desk and written a letter. Not on Thomas's behalf exactly, more just as herself. As someone who had watched this man show up quietly and completely for a stranger and her mother, and who thought that his son deserved to know what kind of person his father actually was when nobody was watching. And she had written it in plain, simple language, the way she wrote everything. And she had given it to Thomas and told him he could do whatever he wanted with it, throw it away if he wanted. And he had read it at her kitchen table, while Rose pretended to watch television in the next room, and when he looked up his eyes were full, and he didn't try to pretend they weren't. And 2 weeks after that, his son called him for the first time in 4 years, and they talked for 2 hours. And Thomas told Nadia about it on the phone that night, and his voice was different, lighter. Like something he had been carrying quietly for a very long time had finally been set down. A year after that wrong number call, Nadia stood in her first university studio with a pencil behind her ear and blueprints spread across a wide table, working on a design for a small community health clinic meant for people who couldn't afford emergency care. A project she and Thomas had started talking about almost by accident one afternoon, and which had grown. The way real things grow, slowly and without anyone planning it, into something that was actually going to be built. And Rose had already told the story of how it all started to so many people that Nadia had genuinely lost count. And every time Rose told it, she got a little more animated, and the wrong number got dialed a little more dramatically. And Nadia always pretended to be embarrassed, but she never actually was. Because the truth was, she had stopped thinking of that night as a mistake a long time ago. Because a mistake is something that goes wrong. And there was not a single part of any of this. Not the fear, not the hard months, not the 2 words she said at 2 in the morning that changed everything that she would ever, for even 1 second, take back.
Thanks for watching my video. Like, subscribe and share.